Hey everybody, this is Tracy. I'm Amplifi's marketing manager. I want to thank you all for joining us for our Ask the Experts webinar discussing optimizing business processes through workflows on the EnterWorks platform. As you know, when registering for this webinar, you had the option to pre-submit questions, which we will be answering today. Yes, this session is being recorded and will be distributed to everyone by the end of the day tomorrow by email. During the presentation, you have the ability to submit questions through the Q&A feature. However, due to our limited time and the complexity of our scenarios, we will follow up after with your questions, making sure that you get the attention that you deserve. Without further ado, let's get to know our experts. First up, we have Eric Gilboe. Eric is the principal architect at Amplifi. He brings more than 10 years of PIM MDM experience to the table as a business user, IT lead, and consultant. He began working with EnterWorks in 2012 when Fender Musical Instruments implemented Enable as part of their new data strategy. Next up, we have Michael Ayanwale. Michael is the EnterWorks practice lead at Amplifi. He's responsible for solution and technical design for Amplifi delivery teams. He is a thought leader and an MDM expert. He ensures that client solutions are both functional and scalable for present and future initiatives. Lastly, we have Brian Zupke. Brian is a senior technical support engineer with Winshuttle and has been involved with the EnterWorks platform since its inception. He has served as solution architect for numerous EnterWorks implementations and authored best practices for workflow development, deployments, and migrations. All right, now that we've met our esteemed panel of experts, let's put them to the test. So for scenario one, we have several product managers who manage groups of products. We are trying to identify a way to make it easier for them to see their tasks instead of all product manager tasks.
Tracy, I think I'll take that one to start with and show you some examples in here of how you can actually do this. Essentially, when we talk about workflows, a workflow is typically assigned to a group, and that group has members, and everyone in that group can see the workflow items that are there, which is great when you're working in a large group. But in this use case, we've got specific product managers within the larger product manager group that are only really responsible for specific product types. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and we'll take a look. And everyone should be able to see my home screen here. What we're going to do is we're going to build some searches that will allow us to narrow down the result set using data within Enable, and then also using the workflow components that we've already built. So one of the precursors to this is within the workflow itself, we have to make sure that there's some sort of an attribute that's tied to the EnterWorks tool that we can use and we can call to be able to share this. So this is an example of a workflow in the system, and we've got this concept of a status update here throughout the entire process. You can see there's a resubmit, there's an approved, there's a rejected, there's an initial update, and those go through a process, and they have different values that get updated on a record that we're working on within the EnterWorks tool. So we'll see that in the example here. If I look across a record, and right now I'm in as a system administrator, so I can see everything, there is an attribute that gets updated on a record that shows us the status essentially of that workflow. So we've got this item update concept, we've got approved, we've got updated, we've got rejected, we've got resubmit and canceled. So those status attributes can really kind of show us where we're at within the process. And then what we can do is we can use that attribute and then tie it to additional attributes within a repository to be able to get the result set that we need. And we can use a predefined search to do that as a simple search. So I'm going to show you an example of what we built here. For this particular group, we narrowed down the search, and we said what we want to do is we want to show records that are in that updated status. So it's basically within the SKU workflow that also begin with a taxonomy that starts with paint. So essentially these are all my paint products because I'm the product manager for the paint group. And so you can see there's a couple of records in here that we loaded up that are in the workflow already that would show up for me. And if we added new records to that workflow, they would pop into the list. Now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a couple of items to workflow that fit the taxonomy and that don't fit that taxonomy structure. And we could see the difference between the two. So if I log in as our data steward, and I open up the repository that we were working with the work items in, and I select one of these items. This is an outdoor item. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this outdoor item to the workflow. And we've effectively added a new item to the workflow. Because it's in a grouping that doesn't necessarily matter to my product manager that works with paint, this won't show up in their widget on their home page, but it still will show up in the master list of all the work items because they're still tied to the product manager role. So that gives them the ability, if they needed to go in and work on that particular item. If, for example, someone else was out of the office and they needed to do it. But it also gives them the ability to really hone in on the products that they're responsible for specifically. So if I log back in as my test product manager here, what we've done is we've tied that predefined search that we created to a widget here. So you notice I've got 2 items that are listed in this updated status, which means that there's in the workflow. And then I've got a total of 7 over here. So it doesn't match up, right? Because there's only 2 records that match our predefined search. So if I click into that, we're back to our list of the 2 records that are within Paint. But I can still see all of the items that are in that updated workflow status as well. If I click into it, I can see all the other taxonomy values, and I can see that all of these are in that particular workflow queue, right? So we can see them. So that's the basics of splitting this out. All you really need to do is have an attribute that you can use. You have to be able to create a predefined search or some sort of way to filter that attribute, be it a filter report or a predefined search, whatever you want to use, and then create the widgets here on the home page to be able to see those changes. So if we added one more, for example, I'm going to go through and we can see we've got a count of 7 and 2. If I log back in as our test data steward, and we just select another record here that doesn't belong to that taxonomy that we're worried about, I'm going to send it to a workflow. And then if I log back in as my product manager, I'm going to see in the widget that now we've got another one added to the list over here, but it didn't add anything to my personal list because it wasn't a paint product that I was worried about. Right? But then the total does get added over here. So I can still see all of the work items. I can also see everything here that I want to, but I have the ability to scale down to the 2 that really matter to me within that overall workflow. So I will stop my share here and we can move on to the next scenario.
All right, so for scenario 2, we have some workflows tied to a group with 1 or a few users. What if a group or team is on vacation, but workflow items are continually created for that role?
Okay, so in this example, what we've got is a situation where we need to do some sort of an approval through the workflow process. And there might be a feedback loop that you'd have in there because you might go through several rounds of an approval. So I'll show an example of how that would look. We can share my screen here. And so in terms of within the workflow concept, if we go back to looking at the workflow tool, you can see that this is a basic, simple approval workflow. And the way this is going to work is someone is going to initiate the workflow item within the UI. So in this case, it's a data steward that makes a change on the record. Remember, we have that status that gets updated. So within the EnterWorks UI, we see that now we're in a status of update. And then we do a quick validation on the record just to make sure everything is valid. And we go through a checkpoint If the record's not valid, it's just going to go straight back to that data steward because they need to fix the validation errors, right? We want it to be a clean record before it moves forward. And if it's valid, then it moves into what we've created as an approval loop here. And essentially the way this works is it's going to forward through to a product manager. It's going to show up on the product manager's plate. That product manager then needs to make a determination as to whether or not they want to approve that change. And if they approve the change, we go happy path up this way. If they don't, then it's going to reject the record. And then the status gets updated in the EnterWorks UI to rejected for that record. And it goes back and stops for this data steward again. And the data steward then needs to make a decision as to whether or not they want to resubmit or if they want to actually just cancel the request entirely if they decide that it doesn't make sense. So in this case, they have another submission split here where they could actually cancel the entire request or resubmit it. And you can see that the status updates again based on that. If they decide to cancel it, then it shows up in the EnterWorks UI as a canceled request. If they resubmit, it shows up in the EnterWorks UI as a resubmitted request. And then you can see it loops right back around to that product manager again. So what we've effectively done is created this feedback loop where we may go 3 or 4 cycles through this before we get it right. And each time there can be notes attached to the actual workflow process before we pass it through. And then when it becomes approved, we update the EnterWorks UI to approved as a status. We validate the record. And then in most cases, you would promote the record and move it. We left the promotion step off of this just because we're just using a single repository in this case. We just want to validate the record and that's it. So that's your process in the background that's going to run. And then in terms of how you see it within the EnterWorks UI, it's kind of the same process, right? I've got a user. So in this case, it was the data stewards that can initiate this. And so the data steward would go into a record, make the change that they were going to make, whatever that change was going to be. So if I were to edit this, and let's say I added a country of origin to this record. And then I sent that on. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm submitting this and sending this forward to the next step that we had seen. So we'll submit this. And then what's going to happen is your product manager then takes over the process. We can watch it pass through. So if we could monitor this and look at it in the background, or we can just watch the process within the UI itself. So I'm going to log out. Log in as our product manager. And we can now see that I've got a new update here, right? Because we've all got that tied. And I can see the additional updates in here. So then that product manager would make a decision on the product, whatever they were going to do. And you can see that there's some instructions for them on the left-hand side. So this works through a standard workflow process within the EnterWorks tool. And then again, I would save. And if I reject this for whatever reason and add my notes, something to that effect, right? And what's going to happen is that's going to feed back to my data steward because we said that there was an error. So it's going to come back into my data steward's court and they're going to see now there's a task called rejection resolution, right? That they need to take care of. So that's how we can create a simple feedback loop, right? Because I could go back into this same record and I could, save and send it again or make the change that they requested and send it back through and resubmit, or I could cancel this request entirely and end that work item, the work item flow. So this is really how you would use a simple workflow process to do a simple approval for maybe one group that would do that. So I'll stop share here.
So in the case of if a person that's waiting or doing that approval goes on vacation, one of the ways that you could have the or deal with that situation is to utilize the 2020 impersonate feature. So the privileged user can log in as that person and act on their behalf. The other is that, as Eric showed in the first scenario, the if you are using filtering to show the items that a person who goes on vacation would address, then you could look at the widget that's showing all of the items, and as long as they're a member of that group, they could act on that particular work item, would be able to advance it in their behalf.
Yeah, and I want to showcase the impersonate feature on how you set that up in EnterWorks. So let me share my screen. All right, so you guys should be able to see my screen. I'm going to log in as a system admin. And basically to show how you can just simply configure the impersonate feature within the EnterWorks platform. So I'm logged in as a system admin. You simply just go to users and groups. You click the user option. And as a admin, you may make a decision that you have a particular user that is on vacation. So you need to identify that supervisor or that particular admin that needs to impersonate a particular user. So in this case, we have this particular user, the test data supervisor. And then you click on action and you navigate to impersonate configuration. And here, enable allows you to select the actual user group. So you do have to tie the user to the related user group. And from here, you can select the users that you want to impersonate. So in this case, I have the user already set up. We have this particular user impersonating the test product manager, a marketing manager, and a data steward. So I'm going to log back out and I'm going to log in as the test data supervisor. So you notice that I'm logged in as myself, but here in enable, the small little icon here on the right-hand corner, impersonate user, just hover over it, click it, and then you can select your list. Now I'm impersonating this particular product manager. So it's a neat, simple little feature that you can definitely leverage in cases where you do have a user that's on vacation. This feature also works in the Enable 2020, so you can definitely use it there if you are using 2020, and I can showcase that functionality as well. So likewise, once I log in as the test supervisor, I'm just going to switch my user here. And now I'm logged in as the product manager, and I can see that user's dashboard as well and the 2020 UI.
One of the things that the impersonate user makes more effective is if you define workflows where work items get assigned to individuals using the dynamic actor role in the workflow, then you can implement workflows where work items don't go to a group, but to an actual individual. And then if that individual does go on vacation or is sick or transfers to another department, then you can utilize the impersonate feature to advance their work items on their behalf. Where previously the general best practice was to use groups so that, and filtering if you wanted to restrict which members of that group saw which particular records. And then the items would be available for all members of the group to act on, even if it's not ones that they would normally do.
All right, great. So scenario 3, product updates need to be reviewed, approved by a secondary source, a product team, etc. How can we accomplish this with EPX?
I believe we've covered that initial scenario by looking at the workflow process that we showed, essentially the simple workflow. So essentially the way that would work would be what we had shown, where there would be an initiation of a workflow. There would be a group that would go to, and then that group would make a decision as to whether or not they approve it or reject it. If it's rejected, it goes back to whoever initiated the request to either update the request or cancel it, and then it would move through the process there. So in this case, this is a very simple loop style workflow with one approval across the board. So I think we can move to the next one. And this is where it's a little more complex.
Yeah. Scenario 4. Product changes need to be verified by multiple groups prior to promoting the change. All groups need to approve the change, but we don't want to wait on a group to approve before moving to the next step in workflow. Is there a way to do this in workflows?
And there is, and I will share my screen here momentarily, and we can kind of walk through that process. We'll just open up that particular workflow so we have something to view. And I will share my screen here. Okay, so in terms of the workflow, what we're doing here is we've got a situation where we've got multiple groups that need to touch the record. They need to make their approval or reject. So we essentially have to have that concept of a loop for each one of these groups. And then we really need all of the groups to approve the product before it moves forward. But we don't need to think in a linear fashion. And typically what happens is most people think in a linear fashion, right? The product manager makes their approval, and then it goes on the spreadsheet or whatever you're using to use your approval process prior to the enable tool. It would go to that person, they would kind of bless it, and then they would email it forward to someone else, and then that group would bless it, and then finally it became an actual product. So the great thing about EnterWorks is that you can split these things out and have all of those approvals going at the same time. So you're not waiting on one group to complete a function, but you do need to have all of them to approve it to move forward. So it's like we do need the 3 approvals to move forward. So the example here would be kind of laid out in the directions. And I usually like to do this when I set up a workflow so that anyone else that looks at it understands the process before we move into the process flow. But essentially the first step would be that data steward would submit the new request, and then that request gets split, and legal, product, and marketing are all going to take a look at the change that was requested, and they're going to approve or reject it. And then it enters a feedback loop for each one of those groups. And then once it's approved by all of those groups, then it can continue through for final validation and promotion through the process. And so the way we accomplish that is by splitting this single item and activity into essentially 3 different flows. And so you can see this looks kind of, the first part looks similar to what we had already looked at with the single workflow, right? I'm going to initiate as a data steward, I'm going to make a change, and I'm going to submit that through. We're going to make sure that what you submitted was valid data to begin with. If it's invalid, it's going to come right back to you and you need to do something with it. If it is valid, it's going to move forward. But instead of going to a single group, what we're going to do is we're going to split up here, and we're going to have a product manager that now needs to approve. We also split it, the same work item, over to our marketing group because the marketing group needs to approve it. And then we have a legal group that has to do the approval as well. So we basically have split this into 3 functions that need to happen. And then if I go to the right, then what we're going to do, since we're dealing with the same work item, we're just approving it in 3 different places. We're going to wait, we're going to bring everything together, and then we're going to join all these before we can move forward with our actual approved update, right? Just like we had in the other workflow, the simple workflow, we've got an approval status that gets updated, and then it passes through to the last check for validations and any additional errors that might have come up on the record as it went through. And then we would promote an email or whatever our end process would be. But what's great about this is now we can see where it's sitting with each of these individual groups as we go through. So if we take an example and go back into our UI format here, again, I'm a test data steward, so I'm the one that's going to initiate this process. And we set this process up at the parent level, at the product level. So we've got a list of products here, and maybe I'll pull up an example product. And I'm going to maybe go in here and edit the product. And I'm going to add my test details on the product. All right. And then I'm going to save this record and send it off to the workflow process. So essentially, I'm going to let them know that I added product details or whatever the case may be. And what we're going to see is that the product is now going to go to a workflow. And in the first example, I'm going to show you a login where I can see, I'm actually attached to all 3 of those roles. So we can see how that workflow item kind of exists within the system here first. So I'll log in as a system admin. And we will see that I've got 3 different roles all matched here for this workflow item. So you can see that there's a product team approval, an approve update, and a legal review that are all attached to different groups, right? It's product manager, marketing team, and legal team, which if we go back to our concept here, that's what we had, right? We've got our marketing team that needs to make a decision. We've got our product manager team that needs to make a decision. And we've got our legal team that needs to make a decision before we can move this item forward. And so what we see is now we've got all 3 of those essential decision points loaded up against this record. Since I'm assigned to all those groups, I can see all these. But if I log in as our test legal, for example, all my legal team knows is that they have an approval here that they need to do for their part of the process. All right, so I can go in, I can review, and I can approve. And then it moves the item forward. But the thing is, it doesn't move the entire item forward and promote it on the fly and do everything that's going to do. Because remember, we still said we needed to wait for the updates from the other 2 groups. So it disappears off of my radar. I don't see it as illegal. If I refresh what I've got here, it's not showing up as an option. But if I log in as, say, our product manager, I see that I still have something that I need to do, right? I have a product team approval that I need to do because it's still on my plate. As a product manager, I still have to go through and approve and reject it. And so in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to reject this. I'm going to say, I don't want this to go through. So I would go to my approval here. I'm going to reject it, and I'm going to provide a rejection reason. Whatever your message and messaging would be, you can send that through. And so what that effectively does is now that's going to go back for that piece of the puzzle. It's going to go back to my data steward, and they're going to have to fix that issue. So it's going to show up on their process here, right? And it's showing as product rejection review. So the key here to do is to always try and update the name of the task to let them understand what it is that they're supposed to be doing within the record. Because otherwise this might get a little confusing, right? They might have a whole bunch of rejections in here and not understand what it was, that it was the product manager or the legal team or whoever that actually rejected it. If we go in and we resubmit, same process. I have the ability to resubmit these records, or I can cancel it if I want to cancel the record. It looks like let's go to, there we go. Now, my record is locked here. 1 second. There we go. For some reason, this one is locking on this reject. And it might be that I don't have access to see that particular field on the rejection. So I'll have to double check on this one. But essentially in the workflow, it's going to run through and reject at that level. So for that particular user group, so in this case, it was the product manager, right? On our product manager side, it's going to go back to this step here, and then they're going to have to loop back around and either resubmit it or cancel it. If we log back in as our system admin, so we can see all of the events, we can still see that there's a marketing approval that needs to happen in here as well. So if we were to log in as the marketing user, I can see that I have a work item that I've got to work with. I can see the notes from the previous person, right? So I can see that the product manager or the data steward added product details. So then I know exactly what to look for. I can check it and I can approve that component. If I want to include notes, I can. And so then just give you an idea of how this works in the background. Let me close this out and we can look at, we can monitor a specific work item. And this may look like a lot of spiderwebby kind of things going on, but it'll kind of make sense when we follow the process. Right, so we can see at the top level, the product manager rejected. So it went back to the data steward. Now the data steward has an action to be able to finish this. If we go down to our track for our marketing manager approved it. So from the decision point, it moved right up and it's waiting. It's waiting for our final approval over here from our product manager before it can move forward. And then in the case of the legal, we approved it as well. So it moves up the chain and it's sitting there waiting. So essentially 2 out of the 3 components are ready to go. We need just one more component in here. And so this item is going to end up in workflow until this data steward resolves this issue and they figure out what they want to update across the board with the product manager. So you could have a situation where you've got multiple components here where they've already done the work, right? And we're waiting at one level. But you can also see that within the workflow process, right? You can see where everything is sitting. And you can see that in the EnterWorks UI as well, based on those steps that we were looking at in the workflow items. So if I log back in, I can see that I have one here that was rejection. And that record is still not pulling up. So there's something going on with this particular record that I need to resolve. To grab that through. We could see exactly where everything is at within that workflow process. And so in this case, we need all 3 to approve, then it moves forward into the end of the workflow.
Yeah, there's a couple of variations that may need to be considered when setting up the parallel type of review. If you have a situation where each of the different groups, if the changes that are made as a result of that review affect the other areas, meaning if legal reviews it and you end up changing technical specs and that needs to be reviewed by a different group, then it's best if the workflow is organized so all the reviews take place. And then once all the reviews have been completed, if there's any that rejected, then the one work item that was rejoined goes back to the submitter with a summary information of you need to make these corrections. And then the changes are made to that record. And then it goes through that process again. Each of the three departments in this case would re-review, because no matter who rejected it before, changes could have been made that affect the other areas. The pattern that Eric showed is when you don't have that case where each of the different areas is independent of each other, but there's still a requirement for the entire reviews to be completed before that record would be considered for promotion. Another possible scenario would be is if the data that's in the different areas is truly independent, then you could look at having, instead of remerging that work item after the individual reviews, the work item itself goes to completion. But then the challenge is if the issues, then you can't use a normal promotion to production, because if the other areas have not yet been promoted, or I'm sorry, approved, then you would not want to be promoting them. But you could take action on that data, syndicate it from staging, for example, but only in the areas that have been approved. But the most common use case is the one that Eric demonstrated, where you have independent reviews and corrections that are independent of each other, but then the final result is that all of those have to be completed before that record can move on. Okay, so there's been a couple of questions that had come in. One was on the impersonate, and the question was, is that a version 10 feature? And it is. So you would need to be on version 10 to make use of that. Another question was for the impersonate. Can a user impersonate himself, or does it have to be done with an admin? And it has to be set up by an admin. The administrative person would determine who each user can impersonate. So you typically would have members of the same department would perhaps be able to impersonate each other, or it might be a supervisor for a group of people would be able to impersonate the members of that group, but the individuals of that group would not be able to impersonate.
All right. Well, if anyone has any additional questions, now would be the time to send them in. If not, we're going to start wrapping things up. I have a special offer to thank everyone for attending this inaugural Ask the Expert session. We are offering a complimentary one-on-one follow-up session with an expert to answer any specific questions you have, aside from those that we've already covered today. This expert session allows you to have that special attention of an industry professional to help you through the most difficult pain points. Amplifi has over 200 years of experience in MDM. And if you're interested in taking advantage of this in a one-on-one session, please respond to our follow-up email tomorrow. The email will come through at experts@goamplify.com. Well, we hope that this webinar gave you the opportunity to see what our company has to offer. Let's continue the conversation on how Amplifi can help your business with our MDM consulting services. You will receive your recording by email tomorrow. Keep an eye out for more Ask the Expert sessions. We'll be looking forward to seeing you and being your resource. Have a great day.
There is one more question that came in.
Cool. Let's answer that question then.
That question is the workflow functionality that was demonstrated, is that available in 8.2? For the most part, it is. Obviously, the impersonate is not, but you can set up workflows so that you have that parallel processing. You could also have the different patterns that were that I discussed of either doing the reviews in parallel, but then the total rejections are collected before it goes back to the submitter, or the independent interactive approval, reject, correct for each of the different areas, or able to not rejoin them and have each one act independently. The only key differences would be in the user experience. The way that the work items would appear would be in EnterWorks 10 would be the classic UI, which would be different than what you'd see in the 2020 UI. But you would still be able to interact the same way. And actually, Eric had demonstrated the classic, so you pretty much would see the same thing.
All right, do we have any other additional questions before we close out? All right. Thank you everyone for joining us, and you'll be hearing from us by email tomorrow, and looking forward to helping you and seeing you at further Ask the Expert sessions. Have a great day.